I arrived home early from my trip without telling a single soul. When I walked through the door, I found my wife huddled in the living room crying all alone in the dark. But my son was in the kitchen laughing loudly and popping champagne with his in-laws. He did not even care that his own mother was breaking down just a few rooms away. So I walked right in and made him regret it immediately. If you are listening to this right now, take a deep breath. We are taught to believe that our family is our ultimate safe haven. We expect the world to be cruel, but we expect our children to protect us. But sometimes the most vicious monsters do not hide in the shadows. They sit right at your dinner table smiling at you while they hold a knife to your back. My name is Harrison Cole, and I am 72 years old. For 45 years, I poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and sanity into building Cole Contracting. What started as a single rusty pickup truck and a dented toolbox eventually became a commercial development empire in Columbus, Ohio. I did not inherit a dime. I had no rich uncles or elite college connections. I worked 16-hour days braving freezing rain and blistering heat, missing birthdays and school plays, all to make sure my family would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. 2 years ago, I decided I had finally fought enough battles. My knees were aching, my hair was, and I realized I had more money than I could ever spend. I stepped down and handed the title of Chief Executive Officer to my 40-year-old son, Brandon. I gave him the keys to the kingdom, a multi-million-dollar company with zero debt. I did it so I could finally retire and spend my remaining years taking care of my wife, Diane. Diane was, and still is, the absolute center of my universe. She stood by me when we had nothing but instant noodles in the pantry and a mountain of unpaid bills. She never complained when I came home covered in grease and cement dust. She raised our son while I was out building the future. She deserved a peaceful, luxurious retirement. She deserved the world. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was supposed to be halfway across the country on a hunting trip in Montana. It was a trip Diane had practically forced me to take, insisting that I needed a break from constantly worrying about the house and the yard. I was supposed to be gone until Sunday morning, but a massive, unexpected snowstorm completely shut down the mountain passes and grounded the flights. The trip was ruined before it even really began. Instead of waiting it out in a miserable, freezing cabin, I managed to catch an early flight back to Ohio and drove my truck straight home. I wanted to surprise Diane. I imagined walking in and finding her reading her favorite mystery novels by the fireplace, maybe with a cup of warm tea in her hands. I even stopped to buy her a bouquet of yellow roses, her absolute favorite. I unlocked the side door of our house quietly, not wanting to startle her. I stepped into the mudroom, carefully taking off my heavy boots. The house felt strangely tense. It is hard to explain, but when you have lived in a house for 30 years, you know how it breathes. There was no warm smell of dinner cooking. There was no television playing in the background. As I walked down the main hallway, I noticed the lights in the living room were completely turned off. The winter sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows across the hardwood floor. That is when I saw her. Diane was sitting on the very edge of the couch, pulled into a tight, defensive ball. She was shaking uncontrollably. I could hear the faint, suppressed sound of her crying, the kind of quiet, desperate sobbing of someone who is trying not to be heard. She had her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and she was clutching a crumpled piece of paper to her chest, as if her life depended on it. My heart dropped into my stomach. Diane was the strongest woman I knew. She did not cry easily. She had faced medical scares, financial ruins in our early days, and the loss of her own parents with incredible stoicism. To see her broken down like this, hiding in the dark of our own home, made my blood run cold. I rushed toward her, the yellow roses slipping from my grasp and falling onto the floor. My own breathing became suddenly heavy. But before I could even say her name, a loud burst of laughter echoed from the back of the house. It came from the kitchen. It was loud, joyous, and completely out of place in a house where my wife was sobbing in the dark. I stopped in my tracks. I looked down the long hallway toward the kitchen. The lights there were blazing brightly. I slowly walked toward the noise, my confusion quickly shifting into a deep, icy dread. I did not make a sound. I crept down the hall and stopped just outside the kitchen archway, keeping myself hidden in the shadows. I looked inside. There was my son, Brandon. He was dressed in a sharp designer suit, looking every bit the arrogant corporate executive I prayed he would never become. Standing next to him was his wife, Megan. And sitting at my kitchen island were Megan's parents, Richard and Susan Mitchell. They were practically throwing a celebration. I watched as Brandon held up a green bottle. Not just any bottle. It was a $400 bottle of Dom Perignon champagne that I had been keeping in my private wine cellar, saving it specifically for my and Diane's upcoming golden anniversary. Brandon popped the cork with a loud bang, and the room erupted into cheers and applause. Richard clapped my son on the back, grinning from ear to ear like he had just won the lottery. Megan held out expensive crystal glasses, her face glowing with pure triumph. They were toasting. They were celebrating. They were having the time of their lives, while my wife, the woman who gave birth to that boy, was sitting 50 feet away, crying her eyes out, alone in the dark. They had to have heard her. The house was not that big. They just did not care. The sheer disrespect, the absolute lack of human decency made the blood roar in my ears. The intuition of a man who had spent 4 decades crushing corporate rivals and reading people told me right then and there that this was not a simple family misunderstanding. This was not a casual afternoon drink. This was a victory lap, and I was the loser they were celebrating. I noticed something else. Megan was wearing a stunning diamond necklace. It was the heirloom necklace I had given Diane for our 30th anniversary, a piece Diane always kept locked away. I did not clear my throat. I did not announce my presence gently. I stepped right out of the shadows and straight into the harsh light of the kitchen. The laughter died instantly. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Brandon turned around, the heavy champagne bottle slipping slightly in his grip. The smug, victorious smile on his face melted away into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Megan gasped loudly and took a panicked step back, nearly dropping her crystal glass onto the tile floor. Richard and Susan froze completely, looking exactly like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. I looked at my son, staring directly into his pale, terrified eyes. I did not yell. I did not scream. I kept my voice dead level, letting the cold, suppressed fury do the talking. I looked at the bottle in his hand, then at the necklace on his wife, and I asked him one simple question. I asked him why his mother was crying in the dark while he was drinking my champagne. I watched his throat swallow hard. I watched his eyes dart toward his father-in-law seeking help. That was the moment I knew, for an absolute certainty, that the boy I raised was gone and the man standing in front of me was a predator who had just invaded my home. The silence in the kitchen stretched out for what felt like an eternity. I stood there, still wearing my heavy winter coat, waiting for the predator, who used to be my son, to answer the question. I watched the gears turning behind his pale eyes. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine fear. He looked like the little boy who had just been caught breaking a window. But then right before my eyes, that little boy vanished forever. Brandon straightened his posture, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit, and smoothed his features into the exact same slick, confident smile he used during corporate board meetings. He gently placed the green bottle of champagne onto the marble countertop. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet layer of fake relief. "We had no idea you were coming back today. The storm must have been terrible." He took a step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, as if he were trying to calm down a frightened animal. I did not move. I just kept my eyes locked on his. I asked him again, my voice low and steady. "Why is your mother crying in the dark, Brandon?" Brandon sighed, shaking his head, with a perfectly rehearsed look of sorrow. He glanced back at his wife, Megan, who immediately mirrored his expression of deep, tragic concern. "It is Mom, Dad," Brandon said softly. "She had a severe memory lapse this morning. It was terrifying for all of us." Megan found her wandering out near the edge of the street in her nightgown. She did not even know where she was. She was completely disoriented. We had to guide her back inside. "She has been emotional and confused all afternoon." Megan stepped up beside him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We were so worried, Harrison," she chimed in, her voice trembling with manufactured empathy. "We did not want to call and ruin your hunting trip, especially since there was nothing you could do from Montana. We stayed here to monitor her and make sure she was safe." I looked at the champagne glasses and the celebration. I asked. Richard, Megan's father, nervously cleared his throat and stepped forward. "That was my doing, Harrison," he said, forcing a hearty chuckle that fell completely flat in the tense room. "My new commercial real estate venture just closed a massive deal this morning. The kids insisted on pouring a glass to celebrate. It was terrible timing, I admit, but we were just trying to keep the mood light. We were actually just sitting here gently discussing some future options for Diane. You know, for her own safety." Brandon nodded eagerly. "Exactly, Dad. We were looking into Oakwood Manor. It is a premium assisted living facility just outside the city. They have around-the-clock medical staff and beautiful gardens. We just want Mom to be in a place where she cannot wander off and get hurt. We want the best for her." They stood there, presenting a united front, weaving a lie so smooth and practiced that a stranger might have actually believed them. But I was not a stranger. I was the man who built the roof over their heads. My gut instantly rejected every single word spilling from their mouths. Diane did not have memory lapses. Just 3 weeks ago, I went with her to her annual physical and cognitive checkup. Our family doctor, a man we had trusted for 20 years, told us her mind was sharper than people half her age. She managed our complex household budget, remembered the birthdays of every single distant relative, and still beat me at chess every weekend. The idea that she would wander into the freezing street in her nightgown was not just a lie. It was an insult to my intelligence. But the true betrayal, the detail that made the hair on my arms stand up, was resting right on Megan's collarbone. As she stood there, playing the role of the deeply concerned daughter-in-law, the kitchen lights caught the brilliant sparkle of a vintage diamond necklace resting against her skin. It was an antique heirloom piece. I had commissioned a master jeweler to create it for Diane on our 30th wedding anniversary. That necklace meant the absolute world to my wife. She wore it every single day. She always told me she would never take it off her neck as long as she lived, because it reminded her of the decades of struggle and love we had shared. And yet here it was draped around Megan's neck. They had not just borrowed it. You do not borrow a deeply personal anniversary gift from a woman who is supposedly having a mental breakdown. They had stripped it from her. They had taken her dignity, her jewelry, and her peace of mind, all while popping my champagne in the next room. A violent urge surged through my veins. Every instinct I had developed over 40 years of protecting my family screamed at me to cross the kitchen, grab Brandon by his designer lapels and throw him out into the freezing snow. I wanted to tear that necklace off Megan and order her parents out of my house. But the cold, calculating business mind that had kept me alive in the cutthroat development industry kicked in. If I exploded now, I would be playing right into their hands. They wanted me to look unstable. They wanted a fight. If I attacked them, they would use it against me. I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went before I made a single move. I had to swallow my rage. It tasted like poison, but I forced it down. I raised a trembling hand to my forehead, deliberately breaking eye contact. I let my shoulders slump, playing the role of the exhausted, defeated old man they desperately wanted me to be. You know, I said, my voice intentionally weak and wavering. I just drove 14 straight hours through black ice and blinding snow. My blood pressure is pounding in my ears, and I am too tired to process any of this right now. Brandon visibly relaxed. I could practically see the tension leaving his shoulders. The smug superiority returned to his eyes. "Of course, Dad," he said smoothly. "You should go upstairs and rest. We have everything completely under control down here. Do not worry about a thing. I will check on you both in the morning." I turned away from them without another word. I walked slowly back down the dark hallway to the living room where Diane was still shivering on the couch. I knelt down beside her, ignoring the pain in my old knees. I gently wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders. "Come on, sweetheart," I whispered softly into her ear. "Let us go upstairs. Let us go to our room." She did not speak. She just nodded weakly and allowed me to help her to her feet. I wrapped my arm around her waist, supporting her weight. Together we walked slowly toward the grand staircase. Every step we took felt incredibly heavy. I could feel the eyes of my son and his in-laws burning into my back from the kitchen. They were watching us retreat. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too tired and too blind to see the trap closing around him. We reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hall to the master bedroom. As soon as we stepped inside, I pushed the heavy oak door shut and turned the brass lock until it clicked loudly. The moment the lock engaged, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift just a fraction. We were finally alone. I guided Diane to the edge of our large bed and sat down gently beside her. I took her cold, shaking hands in mine. "Diane," I said, keeping my voice as calm and soothing as possible. "You are safe now. I am here. Please tell me what happened. What did they do to you?" She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. She still did not speak. Instead, her trembling fingers reached down to her chest. She slowly uncurled her fist, revealing the crumpled piece of paper she had been hiding from them all afternoon. Her hand shook violently as she placed the wrinkled document into my palm. I took the paper from her. I carefully smoothed out the deep creases against my knee, trying to flatten the page so I could read the bold black text printed at the top. The official seal of a medical clinic sat in the upper right corner. It was a formal psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. My eyes scanned the dense medical jargon, picking out the key phrases. Severe cognitive decline. Advanced paranoia. Incapable of managing financial or personal decisions. Require immediate placement in a secure memory care ward. My heart pounded against my ribs like a hammer. But it was not the diagnosis of my wife that made my blood run cold. It was the names listed under the patient section. There were two names, Diane Cole, and directly beneath hers, Harrison Cole. I read the signature at the bottom of the page. It was signed and stamped by a Dr. Aris Thorne, a licensed psychiatric specialist, a doctor I had never met in my entire life, a doctor who had apparently evaluated me while I was driving a truck through a snowstorm in Montana. The horrifying truth hit me with the force of a freight train. They were not just trying to put my wife in an assisted living facility. They were not just trying to steal her jewelry. Brandon had obtained a forged medical document to declare both of us legally incompetent. My own son was preparing to erase us from the world, strip us of our legal rights, and lock us both away in a psychiatric ward so he could take absolute control of everything we owned. I sat on the edge of the large bed for a very long time, just holding Diane as she cried herself to sleep. My mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The forged medical document rested on the nightstand like a ticking time bomb. Downstairs, I could still clearly hear the faint, muffled sounds of my son and his in-laws laughing and celebrating their supposed victory. Every single burst of laughter felt like a physical blow, a reminder of the monster my son had become. I wanted to storm back down those stairs, tear the antique necklace from Megan, and drag them all out into the freezing snow. But the cold, calculating instinct that had helped me build my empire kept me pinned to the mattress. If I confronted them now, with no proof other than a single piece of paper, I would be playing right into their narrative. They would call the police, show them the forged evaluation from Dr. Thorne, and claim I was having a paranoid delusion. They would have me locked in a padded room by sunrise. I had to be smarter than them. I had to gather ammunition. I needed to know exactly how deep this conspiracy went, who else was involved, and what their ultimate endgame was. So I waited. I sat in the pitch-black bedroom listening to the winter storm howling against the windows, and I forced myself to be absolutely still. It took 4 agonizing hours for the house to finally fall quiet. At exactly 2 in the morning, the last light downstairs flicked off. I waited another 30 minutes just to be absolutely certain they were all asleep. Then I slowly slipped out from under the covers, making sure not to wake Diane. I crept out into the hallway. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I moved silently through this dark house, navigating by memory. I knew every creak and groan of this building because I had laid the foundation myself. I bypassed the guest rooms where Richard and Susan were sleeping, and I made my way down to the first floor, heading straight toward the north wing. That was where Brandon kept his private home office. I eased the heavy wooden door open and slipped inside, closing it softly behind me. The room smelled of expensive cologne and imported leather. Even in the sheer arrogance of the space was palpable. He had completely redecorated it when he took over as chief executive officer, replacing my modest wooden desk with a massive slab of black marble. I walked over to the desk and tapped the keyboard. The large monitor glowed to life, illuminating the dark room with a harsh blue light. A password prompt appeared on the screen. Brandon was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He had installed military-grade encryption on his personal devices, assuming his secrets were perfectly safe behind a wall of complex codes. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the man who built coal contracting from the ground up, and that included setting up the original digital infrastructure. Long before Brandon ever sat in the executive chair, I had hired an elite security firm to build a backdoor into every server, every executive terminal, and every company email account. It was a failsafe I had demanded to protect the company from corporate espionage. I had never used it against my own son, but tonight the rules of engagement had changed. I typed in the master override credentials. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before the lock screen vanished, granting me absolute access to everything. I bypassed his standard work folders and dug straight into his encrypted private network. I needed to find the money. A betrayal of this magnitude was never just about control. It was always about greed. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the hidden financial ledgers. When I opened the first spreadsheet, the sheer scale of the theft made my stomach turn. Brandon had not just been skimming profits. He had been systematically bleeding coal contracting dry. Over the past 8 months, he had completely drained our operational reserves, diverting massive sums of cash under the guise of fake construction acquisitions. I tracked the flow of the money through a labyrinth of dummy corporations and fake vendor invoices. Every single transaction pointed to the exact same destination. The money was being funneled into a series of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, and the sole beneficiary of those shell companies was Richard Mitchell, his father-in-law. I dug deeper into Richard's background, cross-referencing the dates of the transfers with his personal financial records. The truth was sickening. Richard was not a successful real estate mogul. He was a degenerate gambler who owed millions to some very dangerous people. Brandon had stolen exactly $6,500,000 from my company to pay off Richard's massive debts and save him from ruin. My son had sold out his own legacy to buy the approval of his wealthy manipulative in-laws. He had compromised the livelihoods of hundreds of my loyal employees just to protect a pathetic gambler. The embezzlement was a staggering blow. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to the true horror waiting in his hidden email server. I opened a folder labeled Urgent Directives and clicked on the most recent message thread between Brandon and Richard. It had been sent just 12 hours ago. As I read the glowing letters on the monitor, the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. The message laid out their entire cold-blooded timeline. Brandon had written that the psychiatric hold was fully approved and verified by Dr. Thorne. The corrupt physician was scheduled to arrive at our house early Friday morning under the pretense of a routine wellness check. According to the email, Thorne would declare Diane a danger to herself and label me mentally unfit to care for her. An ambulance would be waiting outside to transport us both to a secure lockdown ward. Brandon typed the final, devastating sentence with complete emotional detachment. He wrote that once we were locked in the psychiatric ward on Friday, he would activate the emergency medical power of attorney. With absolute legal control over our estate, he planned to initiate a total liquidation of coal contracting. First thing Monday morning. He assured Richard that the remaining assets would be wired offshore immediately, completing the theft before anyone even realized what had happened. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, staring at the glowing screen in the suffocating darkness of the office. The full picture of their monstrous conspiracy was finally clear. They were not just stealing my money. They were planning to steal my freedom, my dignity, and the rest of my life. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of the monitor. It was 2:30 in the morning on Tuesday. They were coming for us on Friday. I had exactly 72 hours to tear down my own son and save my beloved wife from him. The sun bled through the gray winter clouds the following morning. I had not slept a single second. Every second that passed was another stolen from the 72 hours I had left. I had to maintain the absolute illusion of the defeated old man they thought I was. At 6:30, I heard movement coming from the kitchen. Brandon and Megan were awake. I dressed in my standard winter golf attire and walked downstairs, forcing myself to move slowly, feigning a slight limp. I entered the kitchen and pretended to rub a cramp in my shoulder. Brandon was casually sipping black coffee, scrolling through his tablet with the relaxed posture of a man who firmly believed he had already won. He looked up, feigning mild surprise. "You are up early, Dad," he said smoothly. "Going somewhere in this freezing weather?" I poured myself a cup of coffee, keeping my back to him so he would not see the absolute hatred burning in my eyes. "Just heading down to the indoor driving range," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Brandon smiled, that slick corporate smile. That is a great idea," he said, his tone dripping with fake concern. "You go hit some golf balls and relax. We will keep a very close eye on Mom today." I nodded, picked up my travel mug, and walked right out the side door. The sheer restraint it took not to turn around and break his jaw took years off my life. I threw my golf clubs into the back of my truck and pulled out of the driveway. The moment I cleared the neighborhood gates, the facade completely dropped. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I bypassed the country club entirely and headed straight for the commercial district of downtown Columbus. I needed to see Gregory Pierce. Gregory was not just my lead corporate attorney. He was my oldest and most trusted friend. He knew where every single body was buried, and more importantly, he was the godfather to the very son who was currently trying to destroy me. The roads were slick with fresh morning ice, but I pushed the truck as fast as I dared. When I reached his building, I abandoned my vehicle in a commercial loading zone. I ran inside the glass lobby, flashing my badge to the security guards, and took the private elevator straight to the executive floor. I marched right past his receptionist and threw open his heavy mahogany doors. Gregory was sitting at his desk. He looked up, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption, but the moment he saw the expression on my face, the color completely drained from his cheeks. "Harrison, what in the world is wrong?" he asked, rushing out from behind his desk. I closed the double doors behind me, locked them firmly, and collapsed into one of his leather visitor chairs. "I need you to freeze every single corporate account associated with coal." "Contracting," I said, my voice breathless from the adrenaline. "I need you to lock down the operational reserves, the payroll accounts, the investment portfolios, and the offshore holding accounts. I want a total financial blackout, and I need it done right this second." Gregory stared at me, completely bewildered. Harrison, I cannot just shut down a multi-million-dollar company without formal board approval, he reasoned. Brandon is the acting chief executive officer. If I initiate a freeze, he will countermand the order immediately. I leaned forward and looked my oldest friend dead in the eye. Brandon is the reason you need to freeze the accounts, Gregory said. He has been embezzling money. He drained $6.5 million from the operational reserves over the last 8 months. He is funneling the cash into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to pay off his father-in-law's massive gambling debts. I is liquidating my entire legacy to save Richard Mitchell. Gregory staggered backward, bumping into his desk. The profound shock on his face was absolute. "Dear God," he whispered, pulling his keyboard closer. "Give me a second. I am accessing the primary banking portals right now. We will put an emergency freeze on all accounts citing suspected wire fraud." Gregory typed furiously, his eyes darting across his monitors. He opened the main financial registry on his left screen and simultaneously pulled up the county court database on his right screen to file the emergency injunction. I sat there, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, desperately waiting for the confirmation that my money was safe. But that confirmation never came. Instead, I watched as Gregory suddenly stopped typing. His hands slowly lifted off the keyboard, hovering in the air, as if the plastic keys had just burned his fingers. His face turned an ashen, sickly gray. He swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the legal database on his right monitor. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a terrified, hollow whisper. "We are too late." I stood up, pure panic gripping my chest. "What do you mean we are too late?" I demanded. "Just freeze the accounts." "I cannot," he replied slowly, turning the large monitor toward me so I could see the screen for myself. "Brandon filed an emergency ex parte conservatorship order at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. He bypassed the standard waiting periods by submitting a forged medical evaluation, signed by Dr. Aris Thorne. Because Thorne is a licensed psychiatric specialist, a corrupt county judge rubber-stamped the approval just 20 minutes ago. The legal blockade is already active." I stared at the bold red text on the monitor. It was an official court mandate, declaring me a legally incompetent ward of the state. It transferred absolute financial and medical power of attorney directly to my son. "Brandon legally controls every single one of your assets as of right now," Gregory continued, rubbing his temples in utter disbelief. "If you walk into a bank right now, they will flag you as an incapacitated adult. Your credit cards are completely dead. Your access to the company servers is void. You have absolutely no money, Harrison. You have no legal standing whatsoever. He has trapped you completely." I stared at the glowing monitor, feeling a cold despair wash over me. 45 years of hard work wiped out by a single forged signature. My son had outmaneuvered me. He had locked me out of the very resources I needed to protect Diane. We were defenseless. I lowered my head into my hands. "I am ruined," I whispered. "He beat me, Gregory. I have absolutely nothing left to fight him with." But then the silence shifted. Gregory chuckled. It was a dangerous sound. The terrified expression completely vanished. He leaned back, a vicious smile spreading across his lips. "You are forgetting something important, Harrison," he said. "Brandon might have the forged papers and your bank accounts, but he does not own the company. Remember the poison pill clause we hid in the bylaws? Brandon just triggered his own execution. We do not need the bank. We just need to spring the trap." Brandon thought he had successfully backed me into a corner, but he had merely handed me the weapon I needed to dismantle him. Gregory and I both knew that springing the poison pill clause required more than just corporate bylaws. If we triggered it right now, Brandon would fight it in court, dragging the company through months of highly publicized legal battles. He would hide behind the forged medical documents, claiming he was only trying to protect his incapacitated father. I needed undeniable radioactive proof of his malice. I needed to cut the head off his defense before he even realized he was bleeding. and that meant I needed Dr. Eris Thorne. Gregory made a single phone call to a private investigator he kept on retainer. Within 45 minutes, I had a heavy manila folder sitting on the passenger seat of my truck, completely filled with everything I needed to know about the corrupt physician. I pulled into the pristine parking lot of his private clinic just past 11 in the morning. The building was an architectural masterpiece of glass and cedar designed to look more like a luxury spa than a medical facility. I grabbed the manila folder, zipped up my heavy winter coat, and walked through the sliding glass doors. A young, polished woman sitting behind a marble desk looked up at me with immediate disapproval. I did not look like one of their typical wealthy patients. I looked like a tired, angry old man in work boots. Before she could open her mouth to ask if I had an appointment, I walked right past her desk. She called out in a panicked voice, demanding that I stop, but I ignored her completely. I marched down the quiet, carpeted hallway. When I found the one belonging to Dr. Eris Thorne, I did not knock. I simply turned the handle and pushed the door wide open. Dr. Thorne was sitting behind a massive glass desk, typing leisurely on his laptop. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably groomed, wearing a tailored navy suit. He looked up, his face instantly twisting in aristocratic outrage at the sudden intrusion. He opened his mouth to shout for security, but the words completely died in his throat. The absolute second he recognized my face. He had signed papers declaring me legally incompetent just 3 hours ago, and now the ghost of his crime was standing right inside his private sanctuary. I closed the door behind me, turning the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Thorne swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the telephone on his desk. I walked slowly across the room, deliberately taking my time, letting the overwhelming tension suffocate him. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I just stood directly in front of his desk, looking down at him, with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the winter storm outside. I took the heavy manila folder and dropped it squarely onto the center of his pristine glass desk. It hit the surface with a heavy, satisfying thud. "I suggest you open that, Dr. Thorne," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "before you make the catastrophic mistake of calling for security." Thorne stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. His perfectly manicured hands were actually trembling as he reached out and flipped open the cardboard cover. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the arrogant, untouchable aura completely evaporate from his posture. Gregory, U.S. investigator, had done an absolutely magnificent job. The folder did not just contain evidence of his corrupt dealings with my son. It contained highly detailed, meticulously documented records of every single illegal kickback he had accepted from pharmaceutical representatives over the past 7 years. It held banking transcripts of his offshore accounts and sworn notarized affidavits from 2 of his former nurses, who were more than willing to testify against him for a plea deal. Thorne slumped back in his expensive, ergonomic chair. His breathing became shallow and ragged. A thin layer of sweat broke out across his forehead. He looked up at me, the arrogant physician completely replaced by a terrified, cornered criminal. "You are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "You are looking at the permanent revocation of your medical license, the total seizure of your assets, and absolute public ruin." He tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry. "What do you want from me?" he finally managed to croak. I leaned over the desk, bringing my face just inches from his. "I want you to pick up your cell phone," I instructed calmly. "I want you to call my son Brandon. You are going to put him on speakerphone, and you are going to tell him that I showed up at your clinic acting highly suspicious. You are going to tell him that the risk just doubled and you want more money to keep your mouth shut. And you are going to make sure he explicitly admits to buying that forged psychiatric evaluation." Thorne hesitated for a fleeting second, his eyes pleading for mercy that I simply did not possess. I tapped the manila folder. "You have exactly 10 seconds to make the call, Doctor," I warned him. After that, I walk out that door, and this entire file goes directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He broke completely. Tears of sheer panic welled up in his eyes as he scrambled to grab his cell phone. He hit the speaker button and placed the phone on the glass desk between us. I pulled out my own phone, opened my voice recording application, and hit the red record button. The line rang 3 times before Brandon picked up. "What is it?" R.S. Brandon answered, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "I am in the middle of a very important transition meeting right now. I told you I would handle the rest of the payment on Monday when the corporate liquidation goes through." Thorne looked at me, swallowing his fear. "Brandon, we have a massive problem," Thorne said, his voice genuinely shaking. "Your father just showed up at my clinic. He is asking questions. He knows something is wrong. I cannot risk my entire medical license for this. The heat is getting way too high. I need more money, Brandon. I need it right now, or I am pulling the medical hold." A harsh, cruel laugh erupted from the speakerphone. "Relax, Eris. You are being completely paranoid," Brandon scoffed. "My father is an old, tired fool. He has absolutely zero legal power anymore. You made sure of that this morning. Look, I already paid you $50,000 in cash for that fake diagnosis. I am not giving you another dime until he and my mother are physically locked inside that psychiatric ward on Friday. Do not panic on me now. You signed the paperwork. We are in this together." I reached out and ended the call, cutting my son off mid-sentence. I saved the audio file to 3 separate, secure cloud servers right there in the office. I had the absolute, undeniable proof of his malicious intent, his bribery, and the complete fabrication of our medical incompetence. Dr. Thorne looked up at me, completely defeated, looking like a hollow shell of a man. "I did what you asked," he whispered miserably. "Are we done here?" I picked up the heavy manila folder and tucked it neatly under my arm. "For now, doctor," I replied coldly. "But I highly recommend you pack a bag and leave the state, because when the dust settles on this, you will definitely not want to be anywhere near Columbus." I unlocked the heavy oak door and walked out of the clinic, leaving the ruined doctor sitting in silence. The winter air felt sharp and clean against my face as I stepped back into the parking lot. I had the weapon I needed to destroy Brandon U.S. defense. I slid into the driver U.S. seat of my truck, feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Before I started the engine, I decided to play back the audio recording just to ensure the sound quality was perfectly clear. I pressed play, listening to the conversation again. But as the recording reached the end, something caught my attention. Brandon had not hung up the phone immediately. I had let the recording run for 3 extra seconds before cutting the line. In those final seconds of audio, I heard a faint background noise from Brandon U.S. end of the call. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed the speaker directly against my ear. It was Megan U.S. voice. She was complaining about something. I replayed it again and again, straining to decipher the muffled words. Megan was complaining that Diane might actually pass a real cognitive test if a court-appointed doctor evaluated her at the facility. And then I heard Brandon's chilling reply. "Do not worry. My dad is taking her out tomorrow. Tonight I will crush 2 of her blood pressure pills into her tea. It will induce a minor stroke. The court will have no choice." The phone slipped from my grasp, hitting the floorboard. This was no longer white-collar crime. My son was plotting the attempted murder of his own mother. The rules of engagement had just changed from corporate defense to total absolute annihilation. I had to get back to my house immediately before he could execute his deadly plan. I tore out of the clinic parking lot. My hands shook so violently I could barely keep the vehicle straight on the icy roads. My son was not just stealing my company. He was going to poison his mother. He was going to crush her medication into her evening tea and induce a stroke just to ensure she failed a cognitive test. The calculating evil of it made me sick to my stomach. I drove hard, praying I would not be late. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for 3 minutes, taking deep, ragged breaths to compose myself. I could not storm in there like a raging father. If I tipped my hand now, Brandon might panic and hurt her immediately. I had to play the role of the broken, defeated old man one last time. I slumped my shoulders, letting my posture collapse, and walked slowly through the side door. The house was warm and smelled of roasted chicken. It felt like a sick parody of a normal family home. Brandon and Megan were sitting in the living room. When they saw me shuffle in, they exchanged a quick, triumphant look. I walked past them without saying a single word, dragging my feet heavily across the hardwood floor, and headed straight upstairs to the master bedroom. Diane was lying under the heavy blankets, looking pale and exhausted from the stress of the previous day. I sat on the edge of the bed and gently stroked her hair silently, promising her that the nightmare was almost over. At 7 o'clock, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the wooden stairs. The bedroom door creaked. Brandon stepped inside carrying a small silver tray. On the tray sat a porcelain cup of steaming chamomile tea and shortbread cookies. His face was a mask of manufactured piety. "I brought some tea for Mom," he said, his voice soft and falsely soothing. "I thought it might help her relax and get some sleep after everything that has happened." I stared at the steaming cup. I knew exactly what was dissolved in that hot liquid. 2 crushed blood pressure pills, enough to send my wife into a massive, debilitating stroke. I wanted to leap across the room and strangle him, but I forced my hands to remain resting on my lap. "Thank you, Brandon," I replied, my voice sounding weak. "Just leave it on the nightstand. I will make sure she drinks it." Brandon hesitated for a second. He wanted to watch her consume it. "I insist on helping Dad." He pushed gently, taking a step closer to the bed. "You look incredibly tired. Let me sit with her while she drinks." I knew I had to distract him immediately. I let out a painful gasp and clutched my chest, slumping against the headboard. Brandon froze, caught off guard. "My medication," I wheezed, pointing toward the master bathroom. "Brandon, my heart pills. They are on the top shelf behind the mirror. Please hurry." His eyes darted between the tea and me. The sudden medical panic overrode his sinister plan. He quickly set the silver tray down on the nightstand and rushed into the bathroom. The moment his back disappeared behind the bathroom door, I moved with a speed and precision I had not used in 20 years. I grabbed the porcelain cup of poisoned tea and threw myself toward the large potted fern by the window. I dumped the hot liquid deep into the soil. I placed the empty cup back onto the silver saucer just as Brandon rushed back into the room holding my pill bottle. I took the bottle dry, swallowed a harmless vitamin, and let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. "Thank you, son," I whispered, closing my eyes. Brandon looked at the nightstand. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the completely empty teacup. He looked at Diane, who was resting quietly, with her eyes closed, completely unaware of how close she had just come to dying. A dark, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Good night, Dad," he said softly. "I will see you both in the morning." He closed the bedroom door behind him. I waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before letting out a breath I had been holding for an hour. I locked the door and immediately went to the closet. I pulled out a duffel bag and packed the absolute essentials. I moved in total silence. I gathered her warm sweaters, her comfortable shoes, and all of her legitimate medical prescriptions. I woke her up very gently, whispering that we were going on a surprise late-night drive. She was confused, but she trusted me implicitly. She did not make a single sound as I helped her into her heavy winter coat. At 2 in the morning, the house was a tomb. I picked up my wife in my arms, carrying her down the back staircase to avoid the creaking floorboards of the main hall. I slipped out through the garage side door and settled her into the passenger seat of my truck. I started the engine and drove out of the neighborhood without turning on my headlights until we were 3 blocks away. We drove for an hour into the deep countryside far beyond the city limits of Columbus. Our destination was a sprawling, highly secure private estate owned by a man named Thomas Vance. Thomas was a retired Navy combat veteran whom I had helped finance a tactical training facility a decade ago. He owed me a massive favor, and tonight I was calling it in. When we pulled up to the massive steel gates, two men armed with tactical rifles approached the vehicle. They recognized my face immediately and signaled the gates to open. Thomas was waiting on the front porch of the main compound. He did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply helped me bring Diane inside and settled her into a luxurious, highly fortified guest suite. I told Thomas that under absolutely no circumstances was my son allowed anywhere near this property. Thomas looked at me with cold military precision and assured me that if Brandon even stepped foot on the perimeter gravel, he would be met with overwhelming force. Diane was finally safe. The paralyzing fear that had been gripping my chest all day began to recede. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently against the nightstand. I picked it up. It was Brandon. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. "Dad." "Where is Mom?" he shouted, his voice high-pitched and completely frantic. "I went into your room and the bed is empty. The house is empty. Where on earth are you?" I kept my voice perfectly calm and relaxed. "I decided to treat your mother to an early morning spa trip," I replied smoothly. "We are going to relax for a few quiet days." The line went completely, utterly dead silent. Brandon realized instantly that his insidious poisoning plan had completely failed. His carefully constructed timeline was entirely ruined, and his absolute control was finally slipping away. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The profound silence of the morning surrounded me. For the first time in 48 hours, I could breathe without feeling a crushing weight on my chest. Diane was safe behind reinforced steel gates and armed guards. Brandon had lost his most valuable hostage, but I knew my son better than anyone. He was a creature of intense arrogance, but underneath that slick designer suit, he was a coward. And a cornered coward is the most dangerous animal on the planet. I started the engine and drove away from Thomas O.S. compound, heading straight back into the heart of downtown Columbus. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered pavement. I pulled into the underground parking garage of Gregory U.S. law firm at exactly 7:30. Gregory was already waiting for me in his secure basement conference room. The heavy mahogany table was covered in laptops, legal briefs, and empty coffee cups. He looked up as I walked through the double doors, his eyes red and exhausted, but completely alert. He asked if Diane was secure. I told him she was untouchable. Gregory nodded, letting out a heavy sigh of relief. He gestured to the large digital monitor mounted on the far wall of the conference room. It was already connected to his encrypted laptop. "We need to move right now," Harrison Gregory said, his voice stripped of its usual professional calm. "Your son is in full-blown panic mode. When you told him you took Diane away, you destroyed his entire timeline. The psychiatric hold is completely useless if the patient is not physically present in the jurisdiction. Brandon knows you are going to hire an entire army of lawyers to contest the forged conservatorship on Monday morning. He knows he has lost his window to legally liquidate the company." I walked over to the table and poured myself a cup of black coffee. "So what is his next move?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the blank monitor. "He is going to run," Gregory replied bluntly. "He is going to grab whatever he can carry and try to escape before the legal hammer drops." I set my coffee down and pulled my personal laptop from my bag. I opened it and quickly typed in my backdoor administrative credentials. I bypassed the standard firewalls and tapped directly into the primary executive network of Cole Contracting. Within seconds, I mirrored Brandon U.S. office computer screen directly onto the large monitor on the conference room wall. We were looking at his live desktop. We watched his mouse cursor darting frantically across the screen, opening and closing financial folders with reckless speed. He was not even trying to hide his digital footprints anymore. He was operating purely on desperate adrenaline. He opened the primary corporate banking portal. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched him bypass the standard dual authentication protocols. I was using the emergency power of attorney mandate he had stolen just yesterday to override the security measures. He was logging directly into the central operational reserves of the company. These were the funds we used to pay our contractors, buy our heavy machinery, and keep 300 employees providing for their families. He clicked on the wire transfer tab. He did not hesitate. He typed in the maximum allowable transfer amount, $15 million. It was every single cent of liquid capital the company possessed. He was completely draining the lifeblood of the empire I had spent 45 years building. We watched as Brandon carefully typed in the international routing numbers. It was the exact sequence I had found in his hidden email server the night before. The destination was an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a phantom corporation completely controlled by Richard Mitchell. Once that money crossed international borders, it would be fragmented into a dozen untraceable crypto accounts and completely vanish into the dark web. Brandon would be rich, Richard would pay off his gambling debts, and my company would be forced into immediate bankruptcy by Tuesday. My instincts screamed at me to slam my hand onto the keyboard, sever the connection, and lock him out of the portal before he could execute the transfer. I reached for my laptop, my fingers hovering over the kill switch command. But Gregory reached out and grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for an old man. "Do not touch it." Harrison Gregory commanded, his voice deadly serious. "Let him finish the transaction." I stared at my lawyer as if he had completely lost his mind. "Are you insane?" I demanded, trying to pull my arm away. "That is $15 million, Gregory. That is my entire workforce U.S. livelihood. If he clicks that button, the company is completely dead." Gregory did not let go. He forced me to look at him. "I did not freeze the accounts yesterday morning, Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "When I saw the forged conservatorship, I knew a standard financial freeze would only tie us up in civil court for years. Brandon would claim he was moving the money to protect it from your supposed mental decline. It would be a messy, endless legal battle. We needed something entire." Gregory released my wrist and smoothed his tie. "While you were driving out to the clinic to confront Dr. Thorne, yesterday I made a very quiet phone call to a contact I have inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the Financial Crimes Unit. It turns out the Bureau has been quietly building a massive racketeering case against Richard Mitchell for the past 6 months. They knew about his illegal gambling debts, but they lacked the concrete financial evidence to tie him to the offshore accounts. I gave them everything. I gave them the routing numbers Brandon was using. I gave them the proof of the previous $6 million embezzlement." I looked at the screen. Brandon was currently reviewing the final confirmation page for the $15 million wire. The Federal Bureau of Investigation intercepted the routing protocols on the back end of the banking server late last night. Gregory continued, a cold, predatory smile slowly stretching across his face. "The Cayman Islands account Brandon is looking at right now is completely fake. The Bank US interface shows Richard US Shell Company, but the actual digital destination was completely rerouted by federal cyber agents." My breath caught in my throat. I looked at Gregory, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You rerouted the money," I said softly. Gregory nodded. "We built a honeypot, Harrison." We turned our attention back to the large monitor on the wall. The digital clock on the bottom corner of Brandon US screen read 7:59 in the morning. We watched his cursor slowly move across the screen and hover directly over the bright blue button labeled Authorize Transfer. I could almost feel his desperation radiating through the pixels. He was probably sweating through his designer suit, terrified that I would walk through his front door at any second. He needed this money to secure his escape. He needed to buy his freedom. The cursor clicked down. The screen immediately switched to a loading wheel. It spun in a hypnotic, endless circle. The silence in the conference room was so profound, I could hear the electric hum of the servers humming in the walls. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. My heart pounded relentlessly against my ribs. If Gregory US federal contact had made a mistake, If the bank security flagged the reroute, my entire empire would be completely obliterated. Then the loading wheel vanished. The screen flashed a brilliant, vibrant green. A large checkmark appeared in the center of the monitor. Transfer approved. Transaction complete. $15 million successfully wired. I sat back in my chair, staring at the bright green letters. In his home office across town, my son was probably collapsing into his chair, breathing a massive sigh of absolute relief. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully outsmarted his father, drained the company, and secured his luxurious future in Europe. He probably believed he was the smartest man in the entire world right at this very moment. What he absolutely did not know was that he had not just wired $15 million to the Cayman Islands. He had just wired the entire sum directly into a highly classified federal holding account controlled by the United States Department of Justice. He had just committed massive wire fraud across international lines, utilizing a forged medical document, and he had done it all while logged into a monitored server. Gregory closed his laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. He looked at me, the dark bags under his eyes, completely overshadowed by the fierce, victorious gleam in his expression. "It is done," Harrison Gregory said softly. "The trap is completely sprung." He just handed the federal government the final nail for his own coffin. I looked at the frozen confirmation screen on the wall one last time, before severing the remote connection. The screen went black. My son had crossed the point of no return. The game of corporate defense was officially over. Now it was time to let him celebrate his fake victory before I personally burned his entire world to the ground. "Let us go to the gala," I said. "Let us see how much he likes to celebrate in public." The next 36 hours moved with a strange, heavy clarity. Gregory and I spent the rest of Friday coordinating with the federal agents and finalizing the lethal legal documents required to permanently sever my son from the company he had tried to destroy. I left the downtown office late in the afternoon and drove back out to the secure compound to see Diane. She was sitting in a comfortable armchair by a large window, looking out over the snow-covered grounds. The color had finally returned to her cheeks. She was safe, perfectly lucid, and completely shielded from the nightmare unfolding back in the city. I sat beside her, holding her hand, and told her everything that had happened. I told her about the forged medical papers, the stolen money, and the terrible trap Brandon had set for us. She wept quietly, leaning her head against my shoulder. We mourned the loss of the boy we had raised, accepting the painful reality that he was truly gone. But we also found peace, knowing that we had survived his ultimate betrayal. I promised her that by tomorrow night, the empire would be safe again. Saturday arrived with bright, piercing winter sunlight. It was the day of the annual winter charity gala at the Columbus Country Club. This was an event I had personally sponsored for over 2 decades. It was meant to raise funds for local pediatric hospitals. But this year, Brandon and Megan had completely hijacked the planning committee. They had transformed the charitable evening into a lavish, self-congratulatory coronation. Gregory had informed me that Brandon planned to use the massive gathering of the city elite to officially announce his absolute uncontested takeover of coal contracting. Even worse, Richard Mitchell was scheduled to take the stage and announce the launch of his brand new international investment fund. It was a completely fraudulent enterprise entirely backed by the $15 million they mistakenly believed was sitting safely in a Cayman Islands account. They were going to stand in front of the wealthiest and most influential people in Ohio and flaunt the spoils of their treason. They believed they were absolutely untouchable. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance was genuinely staggering to comprehend. I spent the afternoon at a quiet diner drinking black coffee and watching the hours tick by. I felt a strange sense of detachment. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, methodical determination. I reviewed the strategy in my mind, ensuring there were 0 flaws. Just past 4 o'clock, my cell phone vibrated on the table. I looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Brandon. I opened it and read the words slowly. The sheer audacity of his message was breathtaking. He wrote, "Dad, I know you are upset about the recent legal changes, but I strongly advise you to stay away from the country club tonight. The gala will be extremely crowded and loud, and given your fragile mental state, it would be highly inappropriate and dangerous for you to attend. Please stay wherever you are taking your little vacation. We will deal with your medical placement on Monday." I stared at the message for a very long time. He was gloating. He was hiding behind the thin, transparent veil of fake medical concern, but the true message was perfectly clear. He was telling me that he owned the city now. He was telling me that I was a relic of the past, an embarrassment that needed to be swept under the rug so he could shine in the spotlight. He firmly believed that he held all the cards, that the money was his, and that the forged conservatorship made him completely immune to any consequences. I locked the screen of my phone and slid it deep into my pocket. He wanted me to hide in the shadows. He wanted me to cower in fear while he raised a glass and toasted to my destruction. That text message was the final confirmation I needed. I left a generous cash tip on the table, walked out of the diner, and drove back to the secure compound to change my clothes. When I walked into the guest suite, I bypassed the heavy garment bag that held my tailored Italian tuxedo. For 20 years, I had worn a tuxedo to the winter gala. I had played the role of the refined corporate patriarch, mingling with powerful politicians and elite bank presidents. But tonight, I was not going as a chief executive officer. I was going as the man who built an enormous empire out of dirt, sweat, and concrete. I opened a smaller canvas bag and pulled out a pair of dark denim jeans and a thick flannel-lined work shirt. I put on my old scuffed steel toe boots. These were the exact same boots I had worn when I poured the very first foundation for coal contracting 45 years ago. I slipped on my heavy, worn-out leather jacket. The leather was faded and deeply scratched from years of hard labor on unforgiving construction sites. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a working-class contractor who had just stepped off a dirty job site. I looked like a man who knew exactly how to tear a building down to the studs. Diane walked up behind me and gently rested her hands on my shoulders. She looked at my reflection, her eyes filled with quiet strength and profound sorrow. "Go get our company back, Harrison," she whispered softly into the quiet room. I left the compound as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the city into a freezing, dark winter night. The drive to the Columbus Country Club took 45 long minutes. When I pulled through the massive stone gates, the sprawling estate was completely illuminated by hundreds of golden string lights. The long, sweeping circular driveway was packed end to end with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white uniforms were rushing back and forth, opening the doors of sleek black sedans and expensive sports cars. Women in glittering evening gowns and men in immaculate tuxedos were walking up the grand marble steps, laughing and chatting, completely oblivious to the massive criminal conspiracy unfolding right beneath their noses. Brandon had spared absolutely no expense for his grand coming-out party. The arrogance of the enemy was on full, dazzling display. I bypassed the valet line entirely. I drove my heavy, salt-stained pickup truck right past the bewildered parking attendants and parked it directly in front of the main entrance, leaving the roaring engine running and the hazard lights flashing brightly into the night. A young valet rushed over, waving his gloved hands frantically, telling me I could not leave a dirty truck in the primary VIP drop-off zone. I ignored him completely. I stepped out into the freezing air, my steel toe boots crunching heavily against the icy pavement. I adjusted the thick collar of my worn leather jacket and walked straight up the marble steps toward the massive oak doors of the country club. My heart was completely steady. My mind was perfectly clear. Brandon thought I was a broken, fragile old man. He thought his text message would keep me cowering in the dark forever. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the man who gave him everything. You never invite a wolf into your house and expect it to behave like a lapdog. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handles, and pulled the doors wide open. It was time to show my son exactly where he belonged. I was going to walk right into his perfect fake world and burn his entire criminal operation straight to the ground. I stepped through the heavy brass doors of the Columbus Country Club and left the freezing winter wind behind me. The immediate contrast between the bitter cold outside and the suffocating warmth of the grand ballroom hit me like a physical wave. The air inside was thick with the overwhelming scent of expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the sharp tang of freshly poured champagne. I stood at the very top of the grand sweeping staircase that overlooked the main event floor. The ballroom was an absolute spectacle of excessive wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, blinding light over hundreds of the most influential people in the state of Ohio. State senators, real estate developers, and banking executives were all gathered together, laughing and clinking their crystal glasses. They were dressed in impeccable custom tuxedos and sparkling designer gowns. And then there was me. I stood at the top of the stairs, wearing my faded, salt-stained denim jeans and my heavily scratched leather work jacket. My heavy steel toe boots were still wet from the melting snow. I looked exactly like a common laborer who had somehow wandered into a palace by mistake. But I did not feel out of place. I felt like the only real authentic thing in a room, completely filled with expensive plastic. I began my descent down the grand staircase. My heavy work boots landed on the pristine white marble steps with loud, deliberate thuds that echoed sharply over the gentle classical music playing in the background. I was not there to hide. I was there to reclaim what was mine. It did not take long for the elite crowd to notice the glaring anomaly walking among them. A wealthy developer I had done business with a decade ago was the very first person to spot me. His smile vanished instantly, and he took a sudden nervous step backward, bumping into a state politician. One by one, the conversations around the room began to die out. The sudden silence spread across the massive ballroom like a highly contagious virus. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The sea of tuxedos and expensive gowns literally began to part in front of me, creating a wide, completely empty path, leading straight toward the main stage at the far end of the room. I walked down that path slowly, keeping my back perfectly straight and my head held high. I did not look left or right. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the brightly lit stage. There they were. Brandon, Megan, and Richard Mitchell were standing behind a podium draped in velvet. They were right in the middle of their grand presentation. Brandon was holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. He was dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than my very first house. When the silence of the room finally reached him, Brandon stopped speaking mid-sentence. He looked out over the crowd, visibly annoyed by the sudden interruption, until his eyes finally locked directly onto mine. The transformation on his face was a magnificent thing to witness. The smug, arrogant glow completely washed away, leaving behind a pale, terrified mask of absolute shock. His jaw physically dropped. The champagne glass in his hand tilted precariously, spilling expensive alcohol down the front of his pristine trousers, but he did not even seem to notice. Megan gasped audibly, lifting her hand to cover her mouth, while Richard Mitchell gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. They looked like three ghosts staring at the Grim Reaper. I kept walking, feeling the collective gaze of the entire city burning into my back. I continued my slow, methodical walk toward the stage, letting the crushing weight of the silence suffocate them. I reached the bottom step of the stage and stopped, standing just a few feet away from the people who had tried to erase my existence. I did not say a single word. I simply looked up at my son, letting him feel the full, unadulterated weight of my presence. The sheer panic in his eyes was intoxicating. For a fleeting second, I thought he might actually drop the microphone and run out the back doors. But Brandon was far too obsessed with his own public image to surrender in front of the city elite. I watched as his survival instincts violently kicked in. He forced his mouth closed, swallowed hard, and desperately tried to rebuild the shattered facade of the compassionate, deeply concerned son. He gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles trembling, just slightly, as he raised it back up to his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brandon announced to the stunned crowd, his voice shaking before he managed to force a smooth, patronizing tone into his words. "Please accept my deepest apologies for this sudden interruption. As many of you are already, my family has been going through an incredibly difficult transition over the past few days. My father, Harrison Cole, is currently battling a severe, rapidly advancing form of dementia. It has been a tragic and deeply painful journey for all of us." He paused, placing a hand over his heart, in a sickening display of fake sorrow. "He is supposed to be resting safely under strict medical supervision right now. His fragile mental state makes him highly confused and dangerously prone to wandering. Please excuse us while we handle this extremely sensitive medical emergency." Brandon then turned his attention toward the sides of the room, raising his free hand and urgently snapping his fingers at the private security detail stationed near the exit doors. "Guards!" Brandon commanded, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. "Please escort my father out of the buildings immediately and call for a medical transport vehicle. Do not let him hurt himself or anyone else." Two large men wearing black suits and earpieces immediately stepped out from the shadows and began walking briskly toward me. They reached out their hands, fully intending to grab my arms and drag me out of the ballroom, like a confused, helpless old man. Brandon looked down at me from the stage, his confidence slowly returning. He genuinely believed his vile narrative was going to work. He thought he could just wave his hand and have me discarded into the freezing night, leaving him to finish his victory speech in peace. He had no idea that I was not there to fight the security guards. I was just the distraction. I stood perfectly still as the two massive security guards closed the remaining distance between us. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the tragic spectacle of an old sick man being forcefully removed from his own company celebration. Brandon offered the crowd one last sympathetic, sorrowful smile, playing his role flawlessly to the very bitter end. He thought the game was completely over. He assumed he had successfully disposed of the final obstacle standing in his way. But the real executioner had not even stepped into the room quite yet. The absolute truth was about to broadcast loudly for every person to hear. Just as the two security guards who were about to grab me immediately froze, the heavy brass doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. Walking through the entrance was Gregory Pierce. Flanking my oldest friend were two stern men wearing dark suits and federal badges. The security guards immediately froze. Gregory marched with absolute purpose directly toward the main audio and visual booth. The sound engineer stepped back in pure intimidation as Gregory pulled a small auxiliary cable from the mixing board and plugged it directly into his personal cell phone. I looked back up at the stage. Brandon was gripping the wooden edges of the velvet-draped podium so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. The manufactured look of pity had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a creeping, suffocating terror. He looked from Gregory to the federal agents, and then finally back to me. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, shrugging off the frozen security guards. I looked my son dead in the eye, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Let us see just how demented I really am," I said. Gregory pressed play on his phone. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured in the private medical office blasted through the massive surround sound speakers of the country club. The audio was deafeningly loud. The doctor and his panicked, trembling voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, begging for more money because the heat was getting too high. And then the response played. My son and his distinct, arrogant voice filled the ballroom. I heard him laughing cruelly, dismissing the doctor and his fears, bragging about paying $50,000 in cash for a completely fake psychiatric diagnosis to lock his own parents in a ward. But the recording did not stop there. The audio continued into those final chilling seconds. The entire elite society of Columbus stood in horrified silence as they heard Megan complaining about my wife passing a cognitive test, followed by Brandon and his cold, calculated response. Tonight, I will crush 2 of her blood pressure pills into her tea. It will induce a minor stroke. The court will have no choice. The collective gasp from the hundreds of wealthy guests was absolutely deafening. On the stage, Megan took a stumbling step backward. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood stage and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. Behind her, Richard Mitchell realized the catastrophic reality of the situation. He ducked his head, turning his back to the crowd, and frantically tried to sneak toward the dark shadows of the kitchen exit. He did not get far. One of the federal agents waiting by the entrance immediately sprinted down the side aisle, cutting off Richard and his only avenue of escape. Brandon was hyperventilating. His chest heaved up and down in rapid, panicked spasms. His perfectly slicked hair was suddenly disheveled. He grabbed the microphone, his hands shaking so violently it produced a loud screeching feedback loop over the speakers. "It is a fake," Brandon screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "It is a deep fake. It is an artificial intelligence trick. He is a sick, paranoid old man, and he used a computer program to fabricate that audio. Do not listen to him. It is a complete lie." He sounded like a cornered animal frantically clawing at a trap he had built himself. The crowd did not believe his pathetic denial. The sheer terror on his face was all the confirmation they needed. I did not wait for him to finish his frantic rambling. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped directly onto the main stage. Brandon stumbled backward, retreating until his back hit the heavy velvet curtain behind the podium. He held his hands up in a defensive, cowardly posture, terrified that I was going to physically attack him. But physical violence was a tool for the weak. I had something far more devastating. I reached inside the inner pocket of my worn leather jacket and slowly pulled out a single folded sheet of thick legal paper. I flattened the paper deliberately, holding it up so he could see the official corporate seal stamped at the top. I walked right up to the podium, taking the microphone from his trembling hand. "This is a certified copy of the corporate bylaws document you eagerly signed 2 years ago, Brandon," I said, my voice projecting out over the massive, silent ballroom. "You were so blinded by your own greed to sit in the chief executive chair that you never bothered to read the fine print. You simply never read page 42, did you?" I turned slightly, addressing the hundreds of silent guests looking up at the stage. I made sure my voice was crystal clear, letting every single syllable land with heavy, undeniable authority. 2 years ago, when I handed my company over my lawyers, and I embedded a very specific contingency protocol deep inside the corporate bylaws. It is commonly known as a poison pill clause. The clause states in explicit legal terms that if any acting board member attempts to forcefully alter my medical autonomy without the direct approval of a neutral court-appointed third-party panel, all of their executive privileges are instantly and permanently revoked. I turned back to look at my son, stepping so close to him that I could see the beads of cold sweat dripping down his pale forehead. "The moment you handed that forged psychiatric evaluation to a corrupt judge on Friday morning, you violated the foundational bylaws of coal contracting," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You triggered the poison pill. Your title was automatically dissolved. Your executive authority was completely terminated, and every single share of stock you owned reverted 100% back into my irrevocable trust." "You see, Brandon," I explained, making sure the federal agents in the room could hear me perfectly. "When you logged into the banking portal this morning, you thought you were using your emergency power of attorney to steal my company. You thought you were a chief executive officer transferring $15 million. But because of this clause, your power of attorney was already legally null and void. You were not the chief executive officer when you wired that massive sum of money. You were just an unauthorized civilian illegally hacking into a corporate server to commit international wire fraud." Brandon collapsed entirely, dropping to his knees right there on the hardwood stage. The sheer magnitude of his massive failure crushed whatever remaining arrogance he possessed. He had spent 8 months meticulously plotting to steal my life, my freedom, and my company. But in his blinding arrogance, he had failed to realize that I was the architect of the very system he tried to use against me. I had built the walls, I had laid the foundation, and I knew exactly how to lock the doors. The corporate defense was now officially over. The trap was perfectly sprung, and the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire was now completely irreversible. Brandon remained on his knees, staring blankly at the floorboards of the stage. The silence in the country club ballroom was heavy and thick with the unspoken realization that the golden child of Columbus had just been publicly stripped of everything. But the deep parasitic greed running through the Mitchell family refused to surrender so easily. From the very back of the crowded room, near the heavy velvet drapes of the kitchen exit, a loud voice broke the absolute stillness. It was Richard Mitchell, pushing his way past a stunned waiter, his face flushed red with a desperate, manic energy. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the brightly lit stage. "It does not matter," Richard yelled, his voice echoing harshly off the crystal chandeliers above our heads. "The money is already in Geneva. You have absolutely nothing left, Harrison. You are just a bitter old man holding a completely worthless piece of paper. We won." The wealthy crowd gasped again, murmuring in deep shock at the blatant public admission of international theft. Richard stood tall, adjusting his expensive tailored jacket, completely unaware that he had just confessed to a major federal crime in a room full of witnesses today. Brandon looked up from the wooden stage, a sudden desperate glimmer of hope returning to his pale, terrified eyes. He looked at Megan, who was still trembling violently beside the broken champagne glass on the floor. They still had the $15 million safely hidden away. They truly thought the offshore wire transfer had permanently secured their luxurious future, regardless of who officially held the corporate executive title. I stood firmly at the velvet podium, looking down at my son and his foolish father-in-law. I did not speak because I simply did not need to. I just took a slow, deliberate step backward and let the true power in the room take complete control. From the dark shadows near the grand entrance, one of the men in dark suits stepped forward into the light. He walked past the bewildered country club members with calm, measured steps that commanded absolute authority. He reached deep into his heavy winter coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy megaphone. He brought the device slowly up to his mouth, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the undeniable, crushing weight of the United States federal government law enforcement. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell," the federal agent said, his voice booming powerfully over the massive sound system, "that money is not in Geneva. That money was routed directly into a secure federal holding account at exactly 9:15 yesterday morning. We have been actively tracking your fraudulent shell companies and your illegal gambling debts for 6 long months." The absolute silence that immediately followed that statement was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Richard froze completely solid. His arm, which had been pointing victoriously at the stage, slowly dropped, weakly down by his right side. The manic, desperate glow in his eyes was instantly extinguished and replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a man who realized his life was entirely over. He looked frantically around the massive ballroom, desperately searching for an easy exit. But 2 more armed federal agents had already moved silently to block the kitchen doors. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. On the elevated stage, Brandon slowly turned his head to look at his miserable wife. The desperate glimmer of hope in his eyes had completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces of pure, dark despair. The harsh reality of the honeypot trap finally pierced through his incredibly thick layer of lifelong arrogance. He realized in that agonizing moment the full, devastating extent of what he had foolishly done. He had deeply betrayed his own loving father. He had ruthlessly plotted the cold-blooded murder of his own innocent mother. He had willingly thrown away a multi-million-dollar legacy that was freely given to him. And he had done it all for a man who had easily manipulated him into committing federal wire fraud and permanently destroying his own perfect, wealthy family name this night. Megan stared back at Brandon, her face a flawless portrait, of pure, absolute horror. The antique diamond necklace she had maliciously stolen from my sick wife seemed to suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds around her trembling neck. She looked slowly down at the shattered crystals scattered on the floor, perfectly mirroring the immediate destruction of her lavish, stolen lifestyle. She realized with crushing clarity that her own father had used her husband as a completely disposable pawn, and her husband had used his own blood family as mere collateral, all for a massive trap they had blindly walked right into. The grand illusion of their perfect elite partnership was completely broken forever. They were no longer the untouchable power couple of Columbus society. They were just common greedy criminals who had been caught red-handed on a public stage. I looked out at the massive crowd before me. The wealthy politicians, the successful real estate developers, and the elite banking executives were all staring at the stage in absolute disgust and horror. They were witnessing the spectacular, humiliating downfall of a highly corrupt dynasty, a fake dynasty built entirely on vicious lies, emotional manipulation, and extreme elder abuse right now. Brandon remained perfectly still on the hardwood floor of the stage, his tailored suit wrinkling around his slumped shoulders. The grand ballroom of the Columbus Country Club was trapped in a suffocating, heavy silence. Hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential people in the state of Ohio stood completely paralyzed, their expensive crystal glasses hanging forgotten in their hands. They had come tonight to witness a glorious corporate coronation, to celebrate the seamless transition of power to a brilliant young executive. Instead, they were watching a devastating, brutal public execution. The sheer gravity of the $15 million wire fraud and the presence of federal agents in the room pressed down on my son like a physical weight. The illusion of his absolute power had been shattered so thoroughly that there was nothing left but the raw, pathetic truth. For a long moment, nobody dared to breathe. Then the heavy silence was violently punctured by a sharp, hysterical sound. It was Megan. My daughter-in-law was standing just a few feet away from where Brandon was kneeling. The flawless, perfectly poised society wife was completely gone. Her immaculate designer gown seemed to hang awkwardly on her trembling frame, and her carefully styled hair was coming undone. She looked down at her husband, not with the deep sorrow of a supportive partner, but with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She realized with absolute clarity that the luxurious, untouchable future she had been promised was completely dead. There would be no European vacations, no private jets, and no endless corporate credit cards. There would only be federal indictments and absolute social ruin. Megan took a sudden, aggressive step toward Brandon. Her voice, usually so sweet and heavily modulated, ripped through the quiet ballroom in a shrill, piercing scream. She demanded to know how he could have been so incredibly stupid. She yelled that he had promised her everything was perfectly handled, that my medical documents were completely secure, and the money was untraceable. She looked at him with absolute disgust and called him a pathetic, incompetent failure. She screamed that he had completely ruined her life and destroyed her family name, all because he was too arrogant to see that he was walking directly into a trap. Brandon snapped his head up, his pale eyes flashing with a sudden cornered fury. The last shred of his composure entirely vanished. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the hundreds of silent spectators watching their every move. He pointed a shaking finger directly into the face of his wife, his voice cracking under the intense strain. He screamed right back at her, his tone dripping with venom and panic. He told her not to dare call him a failure. He yelled that he had risked his entire career and his absolute freedom just to save her pathetic, degenerate father from being buried by loan sharks. Brandon spun around, wildly searching the room, until his eyes locked onto Richard Mitchell, who was still being held firmly near the kitchen exit by the federal agents. Brandon thrust his hand toward his father-in-law, his voice echoing loudly over the sound system that was still amplifying every single desperate word. He screamed that Richard was the one who had dragged him into this nightmare. He yelled that Richard had relentlessly begged him for the money, manipulating him with pathetic stories about losing the family home and facing violent physical threats from underground bookmakers. Brandon publicly confessed right then and there that he had only initiated the first massive embezzlement because Richard had practically forced him into it, playing on his desire to save the family. Richard struggled fruitlessly against the strong grip of the federal agents holding his arms. His face turned a deep, angry shade of purple as the public humiliation washed over him. He yelled back across the massive ballroom, his voice hoarse and desperate. He called Brandon a lying, cowardly little boy who was just trying to shift the blame to save his own skin. Richard screamed that nobody forced Brandon to forge those psychiatric documents or plan to poison his own mother. He yelled that Brandon had been hungry for absolute power long before the gambling debts were revealed, and that my son used the embezzlement as a convenient excuse to seize total control of the contracting empire without waiting for me to step down. The confrontation rapidly descended into an absolute primal chaos. Megan turned her hysterical rage toward her own father, screaming at Richard for dragging her husband into his degenerate gambling habits. Susan Mitchell began to sob, loudly crying out that her husband swore he stopped gambling a decade ago. Brandon continued to shout wildly, throwing every single one of them under the bus, desperately trying to construct a narrative where he was just a helpless, manipulated victim of his wife and her greedy family. I stood perfectly still behind the heavy velvet podium, silently watching the magnificent, brutal destruction of their fake, carefully constructed unity. They were supposed to be the flawless elite society family, united by their shared greed and their mutual contempt for an old man. But the very second the burning heat of federal prison became a reality, their supposed loyalty evaporated into thin air. They tore into each other like wild, starving animals fighting over scraps of meat. They aired their darkest, most humiliating secrets in front of the wealthiest people in the city, destroying whatever tiny shred of public dignity they had left. I felt no joy in watching my son self-destruct so completely. There was only a profound sadness for the boy. I had raised a boy who allowed ambition to rot his soul from the inside out. I spent 45 years building a legacy that I intended to pass down with immense pride. I gave him every advantage, every education, and every opportunity I never had. But I failed to teach him the most important lesson of all. True wealth is not measured by the numbers in an offshore bank account or the designer labels on your suit. It is measured by your integrity, your loyalty, and how you treat the people who trust you. Brandon traded all of his integrity for the empty, shallow approval of a family that turned on him the moment the money disappeared. The vicious, ugly shouting match continued to steadily escalate, their voices bouncing off the high ceilings in a chaotic, shameful symphony of betrayal. But their loud, desperate arguments were suddenly cut short. Gregory Pierce stepped away from the audio booth and gave a swift, silent nod to the lead federal agent standing near the front of the stage. The agent raised his hand, signaling his tactical team to move in. Several heavily armed agents stepped deliberately onto the hardwood stage, their faces completely impassive, holding heavy steel handcuffs in their hands, fully prepared to physically restrain the dangerous individuals who had foolishly believed they could outsmart the law and escape the crushing weight of absolute justice. The final inescapable act of this truly devastating, unforgettable night had officially arrived, completely closing the dark chapter on their massive criminal conspiracy forever. The lead federal agent stepped onto the center of the hardwood stage. His presence radiated an absolute, chilling authority over the entire room. He did not raise his voice at all. Yet the crowded ballroom hung on his every single word. He looked directly at Brandon. My son was still kneeling helplessly on the cold ground. He was completely stripped of his arrogant corporate armor. The agent slowly pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. He recited the Miranda rights with a cold, mechanical precision. That precise delivery made the brutal reality of the situation absolutely impossible to ignore. He stated that Brandon was officially under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, extreme elder abuse, corporate embezzlement, and the attempted manslaughter of Diane Cole. Hearing those specific horrific charges read aloud in front of the wealthiest and most influential citizens of Columbus was a profound, surreal experience. The massive crowd gasped loudly again. The horrifying severity of the crimes was finally sinking in for everyone present. Megan let out a piercing, devastated wail as a female federal agent approached her quickly. The agent firmly grasped her wrists and clicked a second pair of heavy handcuffs into place. Megan was formally charged as a direct accomplice to the massive wire fraud and the dark conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Over by the heavy kitchen doors, Richard Mitchell was shoved forcefully against the wall by two tall agents. His pale face was pressed hard against the cold plaster as they read him his rights regarding international money laundering, severe racketeering, and conspiracy to commit federal fraud. Susan Mitchell collapsed into a nearby wooden chair. She was weeping uncontrollably as she watched her husband and daughter being completely restrained like common dangerous criminals. As the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around his shaking wrists, the final pathetic remnants of my son and his lifelong arrogance shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. The harsh reality of federal prison crashed down upon him all at once. He realized he was losing his massive fortune, his elite social status, and his total personal freedom forever. Brandon looked down at his expensive, custom-tailored $3,000 tuxedo. It was now wrinkled and deeply stained with spilled expensive champagne. He began to sob uncontrollably right there on the stage. It was not the quiet, dignified weeping of a brave man accepting his fair consequences. It was the loud, ugly, desperate bawling of a terrified coward who finally realized no amount of stolen money could ever buy his way out of this trap. He scrambled frantically on his knees. He dragged himself across the hardwood stage directly toward me. The tall federal agent tried to hold him back firmly, but Brandon fought with a sudden panicked burst of wild adrenaline. He threw his cuffed hands forward, desperately trying to grab the tough fabric of my worn leather jacket. He looked up at me with absolute sheer terror. His face was bright red and slick with running tears. His chest was heaving violently as he struggled to breathe properly. "Dad, please," he cried out loudly. His voice cracked and echoed painfully through the utterly silent ballroom. "Please, I am begging you right now. Call Gregory off immediately. Tell the federal agents it was just a massive, terrible misunderstanding. Tell them we can fix the financial accounts early on Monday morning. I will give the entire company back to you without any fight. I will sign absolutely whatever you want me to sign today. Just do not let them take me away in front of all these important people. I am your son. Please, Dad, you have to protect me. I am your only son." He wept openly and pathetically. He buried his wet face against my heavy steel toe boots. He stained the old worn leather with his endless tears. The entire country club watched this completely humiliating public display of extreme weakness. The wealthy real estate developers and elite investment bankers watched in pure silence. These were the exact same people who had deeply respected Brandon just one single hour ago. Now they looked at him with profound, absolute, unvarnished disgust. I was literally begging for mercy from the very same man he had ruthlessly tried to destroy. I was crying to the father he planned to lock away in a secure psychiatric ward just yesterday. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the broken, miserable creature kneeling helplessly at my feet. I felt a heavy, complicated knot of powerful emotions tightening deep inside my chest. A small, distant part of me actually remembered him as a sweet little boy. I remembered him happily running across the green front lawn. I remembered him asking me to teach him how to properly throw a baseball. A part of me also remembered the immense glowing pride I felt when he finally graduated from his university. I had fully believed I was proudly passing my massive commercial empire to a completely worthy and deeply honorable successor. But those warm, cherished memories were now completely eclipsed. They were overshadowed by the dark, undeniable truth of what he had actually become today. My facial expression remained completely unreadable. I did not show any burning anger. I did not show any deep sorrow. I showed him the exact same cold, calculated emotional detachment he had shown his own mother when he callously planned her early demise. I slowly leaned down. I bent my aching knees until my face was just a few short inches away from his trembling, tear-streaked cheek. The large ballroom remained completely dead silent, but I made absolutely sure my voice was so soft that only he could hear my final devastating spoken words. You stopped being my son the absolute moment you decided to crush those blood pressure pills and put poison into the tea of your own mother, I whispered quietly. My voice sliced through his wild panic like a frozen sharp blade. You made your choice willingly, Brandon. Now you get to live with the harsh, brutal consequences of your limitless, endless greed. I slowly straightened my tired back. I severed the deep emotional connection to him completely and forever. I took a very deliberate step backward. I removed myself entirely from his physical reach. Brandon stared at me blankly. His eyes were extremely wide with absolute sheer horror as the heavy finality of my words completely crushed his very soul. He finally realized that the bridge was permanently burned to the ground. He realized that I knew every single terrifying detail of his murderous, evil plot. And he finally understood that there was absolutely no mercy left anywhere in my broken heart for him. The lead federal agent stepped forward quickly. He grabbed Brandon by his broad shoulders. He hauled him roughly up to his shaking feet. Brandon went entirely limp. All the desperate fight completely drained right out of his body. He hung his head downward in absolute, irreversible, deep shame. I stood firm, perfectly still and tall. I watched with a quiet, solemn, dignified presence as the federal agents marched my son away from the stage and outside. The week following the dramatic events at the Columbus Country Club was an absolute whirlwind of aggressive legal restructuring. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, freezing wind that seemed to perfectly match the cold, efficient atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters of Cole Contracting. I walked through the familiar glass doors of my company, not as a fragile old man, but as the undisputed reigning founder who had just successfully crushed a massive hostile takeover. The entire executive floor was completely silent as I made my way down the long hallway toward the primary boardroom. Gregory Pierce was already waiting for me at the head of the massive mahogany table surrounded by his team of razor-sharp corporate attorneys. We wasted absolutely no time diving straight into the deep, complex mess my son had left behind. With the forged conservatorship officially destroyed by the federal court and the poison pill clause fully activated. My first undeniable act of business was to formally and permanently dissolve Brandon and his position within the company. I signed the heavy stack of termination documents without a single ounce of hesitation. I legally severed his access to the employee servers, the banking portals, and the commercial real estate portfolios. I was officially nothing more than a disgraced former employee awaiting a lengthy federal trial. But Cole Contracting still needed a strong, reliable chief executive officer to guide it through the turbulent media storm that was inevitably coming. I knew I could not sit in that demanding chair forever. I needed someone who respected the profound value of hard, honest labor. I called a man named James Holden into the boardroom. James was my most trusted long-term senior project manager. I was a man who had literally worked his way up from driving forklifts in the supply yard 30 years ago to overseeing our largest multi-million-dollar commercial development sites. He was completely loyal, fiercely intelligent, and he knew the underlying heartbeat of this company better than anyone else alive. When I officially offered him the title of Chief Executive Officer, James was absolutely speechless. He shook my hand firmly, promising to protect the empire with his life. I knew the company was finally safe in the hands of a man who earned his power through sweat instead of entitlement. He was the exact kind of honorable leader this massive organization desperately needed to completely heal and successfully move forward into a much brighter, far more secure future. With the corporate future completely secured and stabilized, I left the towering glass buildings of downtown Columbus and drove back to my sprawling residential property. When I pulled my heavy truck into the familiar circular driveway, the immense quiet of the estate struck me instantly. I unlocked the heavy front doors and stepped inside the grand foyer. The profound, absolute silence of the house was overwhelming. Just a few short days ago, this very same space had been deeply infected by the arrogant laughter of people who were actively plotting to lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward. Now the vast high-ceilinged rooms were completely empty. The toxic, suffocating presence of Brandon Megan and her manipulative parents had been entirely scrubbed from the atmosphere. But the physical traces of their deceitful occupation still lingered like a foul, bad memory. I refused to allow my beloved wife to return to a home that held the lingering shadows of our traitorous son and his incredibly greedy wife. I immediately picked up my phone and called a premium interior demolition and design team. I paid them triple their usual daily rate to drop whatever they were doing and arrive at my property within the hour. When the large crew of professional contractors finally showed up, I gave them very strict, unforgiving instructions. I directed them upstairs to the lavish guest wing where Brandon and Megan had been temporarily staying while they orchestrated their evil plot. I told the aggressive demolition team to completely gut the rooms down to the bare wooden studs. I stood in the hallway with my arms crossed and watched as the workers meticulously dismantled the expensive designer furniture, tore down the custom silk curtains, and ripped up the plush imported carpets. Every single material possessed Brandon and Megan had touched, sat on, or utilized was forcefully carried out to a massive metal dumpster sitting in the freezing driveway. I wanted absolutely nothing remaining that could ever remind Diane of the unimaginable pain our son had caused us. Over the next 48 hours, the skilled contractors worked around the clock to install beautiful new hardwood flooring, fresh neutral paint, and warm, inviting furniture. By the time they finally finished their exhaustive labor, the entire wing had been completely transformed. Every single trace of their miserable, treacherous existence had been successfully and permanently erased from my property. The house was finally cleansed of its deep, dark infection. With the company firmly protected by loyal hands and our family home completely sanitized of all betrayal, there was only one incredibly important task left for me to accomplish. Early the next morning, as the bright winter sun crested over the snow-covered Ohio landscape, I climbed back into my reliable truck. I drove far out into the quiet, peaceful countryside, leaving the noisy, crowded city completely behind me. I navigated the winding rural roads until I reached the massive reinforced steel gates of the highly secure private facility where I had hidden my wife just a few terrifying nights ago. The armed tactical guards recognized my vehicle instantly and smoothly opened the heavy gates to let me pass through the perimeter. I parked the truck near the main compound and walked briskly up the wide wooden steps. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with gripping fear or suffocating anxiety this time, but with a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute relief. I opened the door to the luxurious private guest suite and stepped quietly inside. The room was bathed in a warm, soft golden light. Diane was sitting comfortably in a plush armchair right by the large bay window. She was wearing a thick, cozy knitted sweater, gently sipping a hot cup of fresh herbal tea while watching the wild winter birds fluttering around the snow-covered pine trees outside. When she heard the soft click of the door closing behind me, she slowly turned her head. Her beautiful face was completely free of the sheer terror and deep confusion that had clouded her eyes on the horrible night I carried her out of our home. She was perfectly safe, completely clear-headed, and absolutely radiant. A beautiful, genuine smile slowly spread across her warm face as I walked across the room and knelt down gently beside her chair. I took her soft hands in mine and pressed a long, tender kiss to her knuckles. I looked deeply into her loving eyes and softly whispered the exact words we had both been so desperately waiting to hear for all these long, agonizing days. The dark nightmare is finally over, my incredibly lovely wife. We are finally going back to our peaceful home to stay forever. 6 months have passed since that freezing morning when I brought my wife back to the safety of our own home. The transition back into our normal routine was slow but profoundly healing. The harsh winter eventually melted away, giving way to a bright, vibrant spring that seemed to breathe new life into everything around us. The massive legal hurricane that followed the arrests at the country club consumed the local news cycles for weeks. Federal prosecutors did not offer any leniency, and I refused to step in and soften the blow. I watched from a quiet distance as the justice system meticulously dismantled the arrogant criminals who had tried to destroy my family. The federal trial was swift and absolutely merciless. The mountain of digital evidence, the recorded audio of the bribery, and the intercepted offshore wire transfers left their highly paid defense attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver. Richard Mitchell was the very first to fall. The federal investigators uncovered a sprawling, ugly network of illegal gambling debts, international money laundering, and severe tax evasion spanning over a decade. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He will be an old, broken man by the time he ever sees the outside of a prison wall again. Susan Mitchell was forced to sell their lavish estate to pay off the remaining legal fees, leaving her completely bankrupt and entirely reliant on the charity of distant relatives who quietly despise her. Brandon fought the charges at first, still clinging to his delusional belief that he could charm his way out of a federal indictment. But his arrogance completely shattered when Dr. Aris Thorne took the witness stand. The disgraced physician eagerly traded his testimony for a lighter sentence detailing exactly how Brandon had paid him $50,000 in cash to fabricate the psychiatric evaluations. When the jury heard the audio recording of my son coldly plotting to induce a stroke in his own mother, the entire courtroom fell dead silent. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. Brandon was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. He lost his multi-million-dollar trust fund, his executive career, and his absolute freedom. He is currently locked in a tiny concrete cell, wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit, stripped of the designer suits and the unearned power he loved so much. Megan did not stand by her husband. The moment the federal agents placed the handcuffs on her wrists, her supposed loyalty completely evaporated. She immediately turned state witness, eagerly offering to testify against Brandon and her own father in exchange for a lenient plea deal. She managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, but the financial ruin she suffered was absolute and completely humiliating. The federal government seized every single asset she possessed. They confiscated her luxury sports cars, her designer wardrobe, and every piece of expensive jewelry she had accumulated over the years, including the antique diamond necklace she had so callously stolen from Diane. Today, the former elite society wife is working a grueling minimum wage job as a waitress at a greasy roadside diner on the outskirts of the city. She spends her days wiping down sticky tables and serving black coffee to weary truck drivers, a fitting, perfectly poetic end for a woman who believed she was inherently better than everyone else. With the toxic parasites completely removed from our lives, coal contracting experienced an unprecedented resurgence. James Holden, the former forklift driver who stepped into the role of chief executive officer, proved to be an absolutely brilliant leader. He navigated the initial public relations storm with profound honesty and steady, unshakable integrity. He treated the employees with deep respect, and in return, they worked harder than ever before. The company secured 3 major commercial development contracts in the spring, pushing our profit margins to record highs. I still visit the corporate headquarters once a month, walking the floors and shaking hands with the loyal men and women who build our future. But I no longer carry the heavy, crushing weight of the empire on my aging shoulders. I simply get to enjoy the beautiful legacy I spent 45 years creating. The most beautiful transformation, however, has been right here at home. Our massive house no longer feels like a cold, empty fortress. It feels incredibly warm, deeply inviting, and completely safe. Diane has fully recovered from the terrifying ordeal. Her mind is sharp, her spirit is incredibly bright, and her wonderful laughter frequently fills the spacious rooms once again. We spend our days tending to the colorful gardens, reading quiet books by the stone fireplace, and simply enjoying the profound comfort of each other. This evening, Diane and I are sitting side by side on the wide wooden back porch. The warm summer breeze gently rustles the bright green leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the edge of our property. The sky is painted in brilliant strokes of deep orange, soft pink, and vibrant purple as the sun slowly sets over the peaceful Ohio landscape. I am holding a glass of iced tea, and her head is resting comfortably against my shoulder. We are watching a pair of bluebirds build a small nest in the sturdy branches near the porch railing. I take a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean evening air. I reflect on the agonizing, terrifying journey we were forced to endure over the past 6 months. I think about the shocking betrayal of our only son, the incredible cruelty of his actions, and the extreme lengths I had to go to in order to protect my wife and my legacy. The pain of losing the boy I raised will always leave a small, quiet, deep ache in my heart. But that lingering sadness is completely overshadowed by a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I have finally realized a difficult but incredibly liberating truth about life. True peace does not come from blindly clinging to toxic blood relations, simply because society tells you that family is supposed to be forever. Blood might determine who you are related to by birth, but it absolutely does not dictate who truly deserves your love, your trust, or your resources. True peace comes from surrounding yourself exclusively with people who genuinely respect your sacrifices, honor your boundaries, and value your presence over your bank account. It comes from having the immense courage to violently cut out the infection, even if that infection shares your last name. We survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and we emerged stronger, closer, and far more appreciative of the quiet, simple moments we get to share together. The dark storm has finally passed, and the beautiful, enduring light has permanently returned to our lives. And I will never allow anyone to cast a shadow over our happiness ever again. I spent decades building a massive empire of solid steel and concrete, but I finally understand my greatest achievement was relentlessly defending the lovely woman sitting beside me today. We have successfully reclaimed our entire world, and we will cherish every peaceful tomorrow. Life teaches you the absolute hardest lessons when your guard is completely down. We are heavily conditioned to blindly believe that family is always an unbreakable bond, acting as a permanent shield against the harsh outside world. But sometimes the very sharpest knives are held tightly by those sitting comfortably at your own dinner table. True enduring strength is never about mindlessly forgiving highly toxic relatives. It is about having the immense, unshakable courage to forcefully draw a firm line in the sand. You must relentlessly protect the massive empire you built and the faithful partner who stood by you. What would you have done in my specific situation today? Could you willingly send your own flesh and blood to a federal prison? Or would you have shown dangerous mercy? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. If my story hit home, hit that subscribe button for more videos.